that you have coming out, Workers United, Race, Labor, and Coalition Building, and Deindustrializing America. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what people can expect from this book, or maybe one of the things that you're like most excited for and most proud of in terms of like, this is the one chapter that I was just like so excited to write, and like now that it's coming into being published. So you could just like tell us a little bit more about your upcoming work.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm going to start with the story that led me to decide to write the book.
Okay, great.
So in the mid 1970s, 1975, 1976, there are mostly nursing assistants, but actually, there is a union of service workers at the hospital. So nursing assistants, food dietitian aides, and all sorts of, medical technicians and cleaning crews, grounds maintenance workers who are all together in a union. And so they had recently formed the union. Union was at that point about 8 or 9 years old, right? So not brand new, but pretty new. And they were negotiating for a bargaining agreement with the hospital that they work for. And they were determined, particularly the nurses assistants, they were determined to be able to hold a full-time job and not be required. So they were working full-time. Let me back up. They were working full-time, but they still needed public assistance in order to cover their basic necessities, rent, food, medical care, right? And so they wanted to work full-time without being dependent on public assistance. So they're like, okay, well, we need to increase our salaries. And they also had other issues, right? So doing their jobs, and you become an expert at what you do. And they had ideas that they wanted to bring to hospital management to say, all right, this is a great way to organize the work. So we want to have conversations about what that looks like. So those are some sticking issues, and the nurses assistants were actually paid less than even some of the janitorial staff, which was a male-dominated category. And so there was gender inequity in pay as well as job descriptions, right? And these are mostly Black and Latino women, and they decided, okay, this is it. We're not going to leave the bargaining table until we get what we want. They decided to go on strike because they're like, we can't continue this. We have to fight. We have to make this hard decision. And while they're on strike, so there's all of this press saying that, oh, you work for a hospital. How dare you risk people's lives by refusing to work, right? So there's a conversation going on outside of the working class community saying, oh, this is a public good. You should be here doing this work because you care about people, not because you're trying to get rich, right? And they're not trying to get rich. They're just trying to survive. But what drew me to this, 1976, we're in a small town, smallish, mid-sized town, small to mid-sized, I should say, town in Southeast Wisconsin. And this, again, mostly Black and Latino women who are on the picket lines. Well, police officers are antagonizing them on their picket lines. And in fact, a police officer hits one of the women who's walking the picket. And so the next day, there are scores of UAW workers, mostly men, some of them the husbands of the women who work at the hospital, but some of them not. So 3 different UAW locals decide to show up and walk the picket lines with these women. And so, there's a newspaper article with these white guys saying all workers deserve decent pay, right? And these women holding signs that say work, not welfare. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. This isn't this, again, right? Going back to the history that we know about the past, right? 1976, there's no way that white industrial workers are walking picket lines for Black and Latino women service workers. How can I explain this? So the whole book is about trying to understand what happened that in the mid-1970s, you had industrial workers walking picket lines with service workers. It looked like a fairy tale, white guys and Black and brown women, together saying we're fighting for economic justice. And the more I delved into it, I was like, okay, this story about this labor community has to be told. And what I found out is that Black workers during World War II, and it was really when the Black population of the city exploded, because, you know, Black workers were coming to fill industrial jobs. And so once they got into these positions and they joined their unions and they became active union members, the work that Black workers did in the 1940s and 1950s really reshaped the class politics of the community. And so their work to incorporate racial, bring a racial justice lens to their class politics paid off for decades. Right? So they built coalitions with other groups in the 1960s. And by the 1970s, the definition of who belongs to the working class and who gets to be considered a worker is so expansive that it does include Black women who are often excluded, right, from these categories, right? And when you think about workers, people don't typically think of Black and Latino women, despite the fact that Black and Latino women are overrepresented in the workforce, right? And then also immigrant workers. So in the 1980s, Reagan is president. He's running for a second term, and employers are using immigration enforcement officials to break negotiations. And so they're calling in immigration to do random raids on these companies during contract negotiations, right? And the unions know what's happening. And so they get together and they're like, okay, so they get immigrant rights groups, they get Catholic church officials and community organizers to come together and actually protect these workers' jobs, keep them from being detained. And of the 19 people at this one shop that in 1984, 85, 19 people were detained by immigration services, and they got 17 of them their jobs back and reinstated through this coalition effort. And so, you know, again, I was like, okay, there's another case. And over again, there are examples of the labor community doing things that history tells us they weren't doing during this time, right? And you know, it is true, right, that by the time you get to the last part of the 20th century, in the public thought, right, labor unions are not the avenue for bringing about broad-based economic justice. It's, you know, the idea is that labor unions only look out for members at particular jobs. And so what the book is about is that, wait, some unions did that. Some unions, right, are social justice unions, are civil rights unionism, like the historian Robert Kortstadt talks about, right? And this trend in the labor movement is an important example for us to remember, because again, it's all about how do we get free? And we get free when we center the most vulnerable among us. And that's what those Black workers were able to get their larger community to understand in the 1940s and 50s, and then they lived it, right? So you had 3 generations of working people saying that if I have problems that I need to address, regardless of what they are, the best avenue is through my union, through this collection of other people in similar circumstances with me, even if there's great diversity amongst us. There are things there, we have more in common than we don't. And so what had always been effective, right, even in those rebellions in the 17th century, was to divide the workforce. And the more and more that we understand that that is a tactic and a strategy that has been successful, then we can fight against it and we can come together. And so the book is all about the ways that it, you know, it wasn't perfect and there are clear losses, right? But over and over again, when they stuck to their ideals, they had success. And too often, and this is the point of the book, too often, labor unions are dismissed. And what we should be looking at is a determined effort. And I think we're seeing it now, right? We're seeing it with Amazon, we're seeing it with
Right.
Starbucks, we're seeing it all over the place, right? In news and media, they're all, and nonprofit organizations, all of these workers are saying, you know what, we're better when we work together to solve our problems. And so that's the book, and that's what I'm telling. And I'm using this city really to make a larger argument about the political economy of the United States at the end of the 20th century, well, last third of the 20th century.
Right.
And saying, look, and it's not the only example, right? Because there are great books on Las Vegas and Oakland and Detroit and North Carolina that tell similar stories.
Right.
And so if we have all of these stories that are actually telling a different story than what we know, then eventually what we know about the past shifts, right? When we bring, the more perspectives we bring in, then we get a different narrative and a usable one. So how do we use this past? Well, we use it by looking at these examples and implementing them today. And I think that that's really what happened, for example, in Staten Island with the Amazon workers, is they organized themselves, they talked to each other, they found out, okay, what are the key issues that we need to focus on so that we can win? And they continue to work and trust each other and build together. And they did it, right? It's unbelievable.
No, that's amazing. And once again, I love how you're bringing us back into the present day. Like, you're still taking this historical context and using that for analysis, and still showing how these examples hold importance for today, because we have this similar things happening, especially with the nurses. When you were mentioning work, not welfare, automatically my mind went to Walmart, and how, there were stories about Walmart managers helping their workers apply for food stamps because they don't get paid enough. And so, when you were talking about that being their slogan, and the fact that immediately my mind came up with a current day example, it just shows how powerful the work that you're doing is. And that's my free advertisement. If people go ahead, go buy the book, get it pre-ordered.
I gotta get the book to press first, and then
first
it'll be available hopefully in a year and a half, depending on production schedule. So we'll come back to it. But you said something that reminded me, right? And so I consider myself a social justice historian, and I do history to help me understand the present, to help shape the future, right? So people are saying, oh, historians, they only care about the past, but it's no, I care about the present,
right?
And I know that to get answers for the present, I need to understand the past. Right. So, and that's the approach that I take to doing history, right? I do history so that we get free.